David woke up before the alarm, like he had for months, and stared at the ceiling, trying to remember the last time he actually wanted to get out of bed. The clock read 5:30 a.m. Outside, Vermont was waking up under a blanket of snow, but the real cold was inside him, the kind that comes when you've lost your job, your marriage, and the will to try again. Sometimes he wondered if anyone would even notice if he just stopped showing up. The furniture factory where he'd worked for nearly 30 years had shut down during the pandemic. 3 decades reduced to a termination letter and an awkward handshake. Julia, his wife, had left 5 winters earlier, tired of watching the man she loved turn into a shadow. Their son, Ethan, lived in Seattle and rarely called. Now all that was left was cold coffee, the scent of old wood, and the silence of a house where conversations had run out. David used to believe that time healed everything, but time, he'd learned, doesn't heal, it just teaches you how to live with the wounds. That morning, like so many others, he put on the same worn-out coat, laced up his boots, and went for a walk. The streets were glazed with ice. The shops were still asleep. Cars moved slowly, as if the world had forgotten to hurry. He crossed the bridge over the frozen river and stopped, watching the dark water stubbornly flowing beneath the ice. That's when he saw him, an old fisherman, sitting alone at the edge of the bridge, clutching a short fishing rod, hunched against the wind. No one else around, no sign of fish, just that stubborn man defying the cold. David walked closer. "Too frozen to fish, don't you think?" he asked, more to break the silence than out of curiosity. The old man didn't even look up. "Fish don't know what cold is," he replied, casting his line again. "They only know when the man doesn't show up." David stood there, unsure if it was irony or wisdom. The fisherman said nothing else. He just stayed there, steady, repeating the motion with an almost irritating calm. Back home, the sentence kept echoing like a bothersome whisper. "They only know when the man doesn't show up." He opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out an old notebook, the same one where, years ago, he'd written plans to open a small woodworking shop. The pages were yellowed, stained with coffee and postponements. Unfinished projects, dreams interrupted by excuses. David ran his fingers over the notes and felt ashamed. Ashamed of being someone who always started but never finished. Ashamed of making too many promises and delivering too little. Outside, the wind howled as if the whole winter were blowing against the window. But inside him, something tiny, almost imperceptible, began to move. A memory, a question, maybe a calling. He didn't know what to call it. He only knew that for the first time in a long while, he wanted to wake up again the next day. David's days had become so much alike that he no longer needed a calendar. He woke up early, drank the same black coffee, and spent hours fixing things that didn't need fixing. A faucet that didn't leak, a door that already closed just fine. It was as if he were trying to repair the house so he wouldn't have to admit that the one who needed fixing was himself. The neighborhood where he lived, a small community on the outskirts of Burlington, seemed frozen in time. Wooden houses, flags hanging on porches, the distant sound of a train cutting across the valley. Most neighbors recognized him by sight, but no one really knew him. He was the man in the brown coat, who walked alone and avoided long conversations. On Wednesdays, he went to the local grocery store. The owner, Tom, a chatty, middle-aged man, always tried to start a conversation. "So, David, how's the world treating you?" "The world's getting along just fine without me," he'd answer, with a half-smile that tried to hide his fatigue. Tom knew David had worked at the old furniture factory. Every now and then, he'd leave small bundles of raw wood on the counter, saying they were left over from the stock. David understood the gesture, pity disguised as kindness. Still, he accepted it. It was easier to accept wood than to accept help. The nights were worse. He ate dinner in silence, staring at the empty chair across the table. Sometimes he left the TV on, just to hear human voices echo through the house. When the news started talking about layoffs, suicides, or wars, he'd turn down the volume. He already carried enough tragedy inside. But something began to change. Since that encounter with the old fisherman, he'd started walking to the bridge every day. He never saw the man again. Even so, his eyes always lingered on the same spot, as if expecting him to return. And each time he crossed that bridge, he felt a growing urge to do something, anything, that reminded him of who he once was. One day, when he got home, he noticed the project notebook still lying on the table. He opened one of the old pages and began to sketch a simple piece of furniture, a wooden bench. The lines were shaky, the measurements uneven, but for the first time in years, he lost track of time while drawing. At the back of the house was a small shed, abandoned since the factory closed. The tools were still there, covered in dust and rust. When he turned on the light, the smell of wood mixed with memories nearly brought him to his knees. There, among hammers and screws, he remembered who he was, before the cynicism, before the loss, before giving up. The sound of the saw cutting through the first piece of pine felt like a prayer. Each cut seemed to strip away a bit of his apathy. Each falling wood chip made him breathe a little deeper. That night, he fell asleep with dusty hands and a faintly glowing heart. He didn't yet know what he was building, maybe a piece of furniture, maybe a new reason to exist. But somewhere deep inside, the fisherman's words began to pulse again. The fish only know when the man doesn't show up. And David started showing up. David woke before sunrise. The clock read 5:12 when he opened his eyes and lay still, listening to the distant sound of branches tapping against the window. His body wanted to stay there, buried in the mattress, away from the world, but something inside him insisted on getting up. It wasn't motivation, it was something rougher, like a quiet need to stop dying in slow motion. He grabbed his coat, stepped outside, and began walking through the still deserted streets of Springfield. The city seemed suspended in midair, wrapped in that kind of fog that makes the world feel like a forgotten dream. He passed the cafe where he used to have breakfast with Lisa before work, the lights still off, and his stomach twisted. He didn't know exactly where he was headed, but his feet seemed to carry a determination his mind no longer had. After 40 minutes of walking, he reached the river. The same river he and his father used to visit when he was a boy. The same one where he learned to fish, to tie knots, to wait. But it had been nearly 30 years since the last time. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs. Through the mist, a figure sat by the bank, casting a line into the water. An old man with a worn hat, a thick coat, and steady hands. David stopped a few feet away, watching in silence. There was something hypnotic about it. The calm rhythm of the movement, the patience with which the man reeled in the line, the way he seemed to belong to the river. The man noticed his presence but didn't turn around. "If you came to fish, you're late," he said, eyes still on the line. David smiled faintly, more out of reflex than amusement. "Didn't bring a rod." "Then you came looking for an answer," the old man replied, flatly. The words hung in the air. David stepped closer, intrigued. "And do you usually have answers?" "No, but I tend to listen to those who have the courage to ask the right questions." He sat down beside him, not really knowing why. The river moved slowly, and the sound of water brushing against the stones felt like it was pushing time backward. The old man said, "You look tired. Tired of waiting for things to change? Tired of pretending you still believe in the promises you make to yourself?" David said nothing. It was as if the man had rummaged through his thoughts. "I lost everything," he murmured, his voice trembling. "My job, my marriage, my purpose. I wake up every day wondering, what's the point of going on?" The old man nodded, unmoved. Every man reaches that point. The point where the noise outside stops making sense and the silence inside starts screaming. He slowly pulled the line, checked the bait, and continued. "But you know what I've learned from this river? It doesn't ask whether it wants to flow. It just does, even when it rains, even when it dries up. It doesn't wait for willpower. It doesn't need motivation." David stared at the steady current, feeling something stir within him, a memory, perhaps, of who he used to be. "Do you come here often?" "For 40 years, the old man answered. "Rain, shine, back pain, doesn't matter. If I skip a day, I forget who I am." Silence returned. Only the sound of the current remained. Then the old man pulled a small, crumpled envelope from his pocket and handed it to David. "Take this." "What is it?" "A letter I wrote to myself when I lost everything. You don't need to open it now. Just read it when you're ready to stop running." David held the envelope hesitantly, as if it were alive. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because once a stranger gave me something like it, and it changed everything." The old man reeled his line, stood up slowly, and started down the trail that led back to the road. "Wait," David called. "I don't even know your name." The man stopped, glanced over his shoulder, and said, simply, "Thomas." Then he disappeared into the mist. David stayed there alone, the envelope in his hands, the river flowing beside him like it was whispering an ancient secret. He opened it. Inside was a single sentence, written in shaky letters. "Consistency is love in the form of action. Everything else is just intention in disguise." David read those words again and again, until the wind tore the paper from his hands and carried it into the water. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't try to stop it. He just watched. And realized that maybe, for the first time, he was ready to let the past go and start moving again. 3 weeks had passed since that meeting by the river. David still remembered every word Thomas had said, but above all, that one sentence: "Consistency is love in the form of action." It echoed in his mind at random moments while washing dishes, crossing the street, or staring at his own reflection, trying to recognize the man in the mirror. But, as with most things in life, good intentions began to lose their strength. The Vermont cold grew harsher, and the emptiness started lurking in the mornings again. David still hadn't figured out what to do with his life. He only knew he didn't want to keep being the man who woke up for no reason. On a great Tuesday, he opened his laptop and saw the bank notification. His balance was nearly gone. The money from selling his parents' house would barely cover another month of expenses. He closed the laptop and stared at his hands, trembling, dry, aged. Shame rose through his chest like fire. He realized it wasn't just the money that was running out. It was him. That's when he remembered the envelope. Not the letter. The wind had taken that, but the gesture. Thomas had given it to him without expecting anything in return. And that's what struck him. To act without waiting for something back. Consistency as a form of love. David stood up. He opened a kitchen drawer and pulled out an old notebook, the same one where he'd once written plans he never kept. On the first page, he wrote only, "Today, I start small, but I start." Then he left the house. Outside, the world was covered by a thin layer of snow. The corner cafe, the one he used to avoid out of embarrassment, afraid of running into people he knew, suddenly seemed less threatening. He walked in, ordered a plain coffee, and sat down. Next to him, an elderly woman was reading a newspaper, her expression weary. When she reached for her cup and dropped her napkin, David instinctively bent down to pick it up. "Thank you, dear," she said, smiling with genuine warmth. He gave her a shy nod, but something in that small exchange warmed him. Consistency is love in action. He left with a light feeling, subtle but real, like someone had lit a candle in a dark room. Over the next few days, he built a new routine. He woke at 6, brewed coffee, walked to the river, and spent 20 minutes sitting in the same spot where he'd met Thomas. He didn't expect anything, didn't plan anything. He simply showed up. At first, it felt pointless, but little by little, his mind began to quiet down. And in that silence, something new began to emerge, a desire to create. David had always been good with his hands. Before the factory went bankrupt, he made custom furniture, a craft he'd learned from his father. There were still a few rusted tools in the garage. One afternoon, he cleaned the space and began to work. Not to sell, not to prove anything, just to touch life with his own hands again. The first chair came out crooked, the second a little better, and by the third, something shifted. While sanding the wood, he noticed his breathing had changed. There was no rush, no inner voice saying it's pointless. Only him, the sound of friction, and the feeling that finally he was alive again. One morning, while sweeping the garage, he heard a sound outside. A boy on a bike, maybe 10 years old, had stopped to look at the chair leaning against the door. "Did you make that, sir?" the boy asked. "I did." "That's nice. Looks like something from a store." "Thank you, kid." The boy pedaled away, and David stood there staring at the chair. It was just wood and varnish, but in that moment, it felt like more than that. It was proof that he existed again. That night, he walked to the river with his notebook under his arm. He sat in his usual spot. The wind was strong and the sky clear enough to reveal the stars. He opened the notebook and wrote, 3 weeks. No big miracles, no big success. But I've been waking up. I've been doing. I've been living. He closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and looked at the water. For the first time, he realized the river didn't make noise because it was full or empty. It made noise because it was moving. David smiled, not out of relief, but out of recognition. And in that instant, he understood true new beginnings don't arrive like waves. They come like drops, steady, insistent, almost imperceptible, until one day, without warning, they overflow. The next morning, while sipping his coffee, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. On the other end, a rough but familiar voice. "I thought you'd thrown my note away," Thomas said. David smiled, his eyes watering. "I didn't throw it away, Thomas. The wind took it." "Sometimes the wind takes things just to see if we'll chase after them." The old man chuckled softly. "Why are you calling me?" "Because there's something I need to show you. And because, son, I think it's time you learned how to fish for real." The call ended. David stood still, holding the phone. Then he looked out the window. The sun was rising, dissolving the mist over the valley. And for the first time in a long while, he realized he wasn't the same man who used to wake up before the alarm. He was someone who had finally learned to stand up again. Winter had finally begun to loosen its grip. The snow was melting slowly, revealing the worn ground beneath the streets and the first quiet signs of life returning. Small puddles, stubborn green branches pushing their way through the frost. David watched it all from the porch, a mug of coffee in his hands and the same old notebook resting on his lap. That garage had become his new workshop. The once forgotten tools now gleamed again, and the chairs he crafted were starting to catch the neighbors' attention. It wasn't a business, not yet, but it wasn't just a pastime anymore either. It was the thread that tied him back to the world. Thomas visited him twice a week. They never spoke about the past, only about the day, the weather, the river. David noticed that the old man talked less and less with each visit, but his eyes spoke volumes. It was as if he knew his work there was done. One afternoon, while they were sanding a plank together, Thomas broke the silence. "You know what's funny, kid? People spend their whole lives searching for meaning, but meaning doesn't show up when you think about it. It shows up when you do something." David looked up and simply nodded. He was no longer the same man who had met that old fisherman by the river. Despair had turned into clarity. Fear had turned into presence. "And what if one day I stopped doing?" Thomas smiled, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who already understands everything. "Then the world will remind you. The river always calls back those who once learned to listen." 2 weeks later, Thomas didn't show up. Not by the river, not at his old house. David went looking for him. He found the door half open, the fireplace cold, and on the table, an envelope. The same kind of envelope the old man had once given him. Inside, a note written in shaky handwriting. "Everything the river taught me, I have already passed on to you. When the waters grow too still, it means it's time to teach someone else how to row." David stood there motionless for a long time. There was no sadness, only a deep, peaceful silence, the kind that comes when life has fulfilled its purpose. He stepped outside, looked up at the sky, and the cold wind brushed against his face. He smiled. He knew the old man hadn't really gone. He had simply gone back to the river. Months later, the workshop doors stood open to anyone who wanted to learn. Curious children, lonely retirees, lost young adults, all found there a place to start over. David never charged a thing. He only asked, "Just promise me one thing. Keep showing up, even on the bad days." And when they asked him what the place was called, he answered without hesitation, "Constancy." One morning, while walking to the river, David brought the notebook along. He sat in the same spot as always, now covered in fresh leaves. He opened it to the last page and wrote, "It wasn't luck. It wasn't a miracle. It was constancy. The kind of love that makes no noise but changes everything it touches." He closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and watched the water flow. The river kept moving, and so did he. The sound of the current blended with the faint song of distant birds. David stood up, adjusted his coat, and started walking back. Steady steps, calm eyes. He now understood that starting over isn't about going back to who you were. It's about learning to walk differently, with the same heart, but a new rhythm. And as the wind whispered through the trees, he heard, one last time, the voice of old Thomas within him. Constancy is love in action. David smiled and kept walking.